You're here because Robert is here with us, and we are really happy to have the good, the bad, and the very ugly structuring IT organizations with Robert Falkowitz. Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you, Matteo. You know, when I first saw the logo that they made for this event, this DevOps Days event, I said, I better grow a beard. So I started to grow a beard, and it came out gray. So I shaved it off, and I tried again. The next time, it came out white. I said, well, all right, I'm going to have to live with that, because each one of those white hairs comes from some problem that I've had to address over the past decades in helping organizations do a better job in fulfilling their mission. And so thank you very much for giving me the chance to share with you today some of the things that I've learned about changing organizational structure. One brief word about myself. What I do currently is coaching and training, Kanban and Lean. I'm based here in Geneva, but I also have courses online. So if you're interested in that sort of activity, come and see me. So, the question is, what's happening in organizational change? I'm going to go straight to my conclusion, okay? Basically, as far as I can tell, there are fundamentally two poles, two cultures, we could say, for how organizations handle, how they change their structures. And one of them conceives of change as filling a gap. There's a to-be situation, there's an as-is situation. What do we need to do to reach that to-be situation? And very frequently, they're very much concerned with the very important issue of how to maximize inter-team coordination, which is a big issue, and they want to avoid this kind of issue. And finally, the knowledge that's associated with that approach is very much a knowledge that is coming from outside of the organization. Maybe they brought a consultant in, or maybe somebody read a book, or maybe there's a senior manager who wants to make his or her mark on the organization by changing the structure. The other culture is more concerned with solving immediate problems. There's a problem, we think it has to do with the structure. What should we do to change the structure in order to resolve that problem? Those types of approaches are more concerned with maximizing the self-organization of the structures that they're concerned with. And finally, the knowledge that is created as a result of making the changes in the structure are created internally and maintained internally in the organization. So keeping those points in mind, I've come to a couple of observations. One is that when you change the structure of an organization in order to make some kind of improvement, what you're doing at the same time is you're sowing the seeds for some future problem that is going to need yet another change. And skipping those cycles of change is probably a really bad idea. And one of the reasons for that is that being successful in future cycles of change depend upon what you have learned in past cycles of change. So if you skip them, you don't learn things and you're not well prepared. So basically, that's where I'm headed. But what's interesting, of course, is not my conclusion, but the journey to get there. So let's talk about that a little bit. I'm going to use what I call organizational archaeology as a method. Now, the big problem, of course, is that you cannot apply the scientific method to questions like this. You cannot say, all right, let's change an organization and then see how it goes, and a couple of years later say, oh, well, that didn't work so well. Let's roll everything back to the way it was 3 or 4 years ago. We'll try something else. You can't do that. So you have to do what archaeologists do. You dig a little bit here, you dig a little bit there. You find bits and pieces of information, but there's no one single case study that will give you all of the information you need in order to understand what's happening when you change organizational structure. And so we need to piece them together from many, many different sources. Now, one of the issues is that when you gather data, all you're really seeing, generally speaking, are snapshots. Now, let me make an analogy. This is a photograph taken at a Supercross event. And you see there's somebody riding, and they're flying high in the air. Well, you don't know if they're leading the pack or if they're far behind the rest of the pack, but you have a view at that instant in time. Or maybe you have another view, and here you see a rider whose arms are starting to flail, but are they showing off? You know, they love to do that at Supercross events. Or maybe they're losing their balance. We don't know, but we have that snapshot. Or if we take another example, well, there the person has obviously lost their balance, they've fallen, and they're out of the race. So we have this series of snapshots, but they're all kind of ambiguous, and the challenge is to try to figure out how they all get pieced together. Now, if we had a video like that, then we would have some kind of idea of how they all piece together, but that's what we're trying to do now, trying to make, if you will, a video of different snapshots that occur about changes to organizational structure. So my scope is basically IT organizations, but I think the remarks that I'm going to make are applicable outside of IT, but I want to just emphasize that I'm not specifically talking about the software lifecycle and the organizations that are built around managing a software lifecycle. I make that point because today, much of the discussion about IT organizations is concerned precisely with that point. But I've worked with a lot of different organizations over the years, and I think that only a very small percentage of them actually had a lot of developers, and a lot of what they were doing was built around the applications that they were building in-house. And the vast majority of them didn't develop anything at all, and yet they had IT organizations. So we need to talk about more than just the software lifecycle. All right, let me just give you a bigger picture of how this fits together in terms of how an organization evolves. An organization needs to have resources, needs to have ways of obtaining resources. And with those resources, it can create some type of strategy for organizing those resources. And the organization of those resources allows the organization to develop its capabilities. Those capabilities are of all sorts of things. Some of them will be enhanced or facilitated by the organizational structure, but of course there are many other capabilities. The capabilities are used so that the organization is able to create distinctiveness. And if it's not distinctive, well, it goes out of business. Distinctiveness is used in turn to be able to get more resources. And so the important point is that there is this cycle, a continual cycle of changing circumstances, changing events that serve to develop, to enhance, to create, or perhaps to destroy some of the capabilities of the organization. So we want to think about the capabilities that are developed thanks to organizational structure in terms of this type of cycle. So why is it important? Why do we want to talk about organizational structure? Well, of course, it has a lot to do with the efficiency and the effectiveness of the flow of work. It has a lot to do with the ability of the organization to have a clear mission, a clear vision of what it's all about. It has to do with psychological factors like the motivation of the people who are working there. It has to do with the psychological safety of the people. It might, and I emphasize the word might, have some kind of impact on the products that are being created by the organization. So there's Conway's hypothesis, which is very important in this context. So can I just see a show of hands? Who knows about Conway? And yeah, a lot of people know about Conway. Of course, you know it as Conway's law, but I call it Conway's hypothesis because I don't think it has ever met any of the qualifications for being a law. So Conway wrote an article, Melvin Conway wrote an article in 1968, published in Datamation, in which he said that the communications channels internal to an organization that is designing a system, the patterns of communication will be reflected in the systems that they design. And the people who, his colleagues who reviewed that article afterwards, dubbed it as Conway's Law. And then it fell into obscurity until maybe 10 or 15 years ago when people in the software engineering business kind of brought it back to life and talked about how an organization's structure will be reflected in the structure of the software that it creates. Subtle change. They're now talking about the structure of the organization, not the communication pathways through the organization. One thing I'm pretty sure about, I know that there's evidence to support that hypothesis in the context of software engineering. There's also some evidence against it. But once you get outside of the software domain, and when I say software, I mean it in the original sense of the term, things that are soft, that can easily be reconfigured and changed and managed, as opposed to hardware, looking at hardware like networks of roads or a battleship or a hospital. The structure of a hospital is not determined by the structure of the team of architects that design it. It's determined by the needs of the owners and the users of the hospital, who then make their requirements known to the architects, and they create the very complex system, which is a hospital, on that basis. So I think that Conway's remarks, which were never proven by Conway himself, remains a hypothesis. Some other points about why structure is important. It can facilitate continual improvement. It can facilitate organizational activity. So lots of good reasons then to talk about why it's important to structure your organization in a certain way. But if you're going to talk about that issue, you have to address the fact that there's an elephant in the room. And that elephant is the book that was written by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais called Team Topologies. Again, who's read that book? Anybody? A few people have read the book. Maybe you have seen on the website about team topologies that talk about it. So, okay, there's a little bit of familiarity. It's a very interesting book. It's really worth reading. And there's a terrible amount of information in there that becomes very accessible. And there are a couple of things about the book which I think are very important. So when I talk about team topologies, I'm talking about that book. One is the assumption that the teams in our IT organizations are complex, adaptive structures. I'll come back to that. And the other is that the circumstances are always changing. They're constantly changing. So that's very, very important. That's the basis for everything else we need to discuss when we talk about organizational change. On the other hand, there are some things I'm not terribly happy with. Conway's hypothesis is treated as dogma in that book. And I'm not sure that that's really a good way to approach it. Problem not with the book, but with the way many organizations that I've seen use the book. They have this idea that team topologies is prescribing the best way to organize organizations. And then they try to do what the book tells them to do. And it underplays the whole issue of the journey they have to go through to reach whatever is a good solution for them. And finally, I think that there needs to be more emphasis on questions like the availability of skills and politics and personalities and all of the other things, various capabilities that are important in finally deciding how an organization is able to do its work. So read the book. but read it with a very critical eye. All right, so we said IT organizations are a complex adaptive system. Everybody knows what that is? And who knows what a complex adaptive system is? All right, let me go into a very brief description of what I'm talking about there. Okay, so a complex adaptive system is a system of various components. When we talk about this in the context of complexity theory, we talk about agents, and those agents interact in various ways. The important thing is that you cannot predict the behavior of the system based upon the behavior of the individual agents or components of the system. If you look at this illustration of the three-body problem in physics, so I've got three bodies, and they're just obeying Newton's laws, whether it's gravitation or conservation of momentum, and yet you can see from the lines that are being drawn that their behavior is immensely complex. Now, think about an IT organization with a series of teams and people and partners and customers. And we don't have anything as simple and as clear as Newton's laws to describe what's happening in that organization. So you see, this gives you a little graphical insight into the complexity of what's happening in a complex adaptive system. The behavior of the agents within the system is nonlinear. Okay, so let's take an analogy, the commonly used one, a system with a predator and a prey. Okay, so you've got the prey, in this case, a hare, and they come into my garden. You know why I have the pitchfork? It's to fend off the hares, because they come into my garden, they eat my carrots, they eat my lettuce, they eat my broccoli, they love the broccoli, and they reproduce. So you got a lot of hares. Well, okay, so that attracts the foxes, and the foxes like to eat the hares. So the foxes reproduce, but they also control the population of the hares. So you see that there are various types of behavior that are influencing each other. And the point is, these are nonlinear. So if you look at the relative populations of the foxes and the hares, you see that it's no straight line. It's not like you've got an independent variable and a dependent variable, and zoop, you got a straight line or even a logarithmic line. It's much more complicated than that. And it's extremely sensitive to changes in the circumstances, changes in the initial state of the system. So I'll give you an example of that. But where are we? There we are. So suppose I say, well, you know, foxes, they're much more dynamic than that, or just a tiny little bit more dynamic than that. And what happens basically is they eat up all of the hares, and they will eventually starve themselves. Or let's suppose instead of starting off with 20 foxes, I started off with 40 foxes. Okay? And again, a completely different pattern for what's happening. Similarly, if I start off with 500 hares instead of 1,000 hares, completely different nonlinear type of relationship. You can't see anything. Well, that's too bad. All right, you have to take my word for it. Okay. All right, so I have different agents within the system, and they influence each other via various types of feedback loops. So we've got basically two kinds of feedback loops. They've got the loops that reinforce a certain pattern until such time as they're controlled by some kind of balancing loop. So let's take an example. I have an organization, it's very successful, but one of the problems with the organization is that it does work in a poorly scalable way, so that because it's more successful, they have to hire more resources. So they get more personnel, and again, they have to hire more management personnel because they're not working in a very scalable way. So they have more management personnel, they're very expensive, and the result is the organization has higher and higher costs, and they become less and less competitive, and so they become less and less successful. Another example with a balancing loop, you've got an organization, it hires more people, and now you say, well, I've got different teams, and they're doing a good job. I need more people. How am I going to get them to work with the teams without destroying the successful work that the teams are doing? And so I might put in place some type of balancing activity to do training, to do coaching, to do exercise for the team as a way of feeding back and maintaining a balance in the loop. Okay, so you've got these different kinds of loops. And the result is you have patterns of behavior that emerge. So let's think about what happens when, let's say, a senior manager in an organization announces that there's a new strategy, a new policy. Something has changed the circumstances under which the people in the organization are working. And now the people working in the different teams are asking legitimate questions about what that means with respect to how they're going to be doing their work. And each team is going to have different questions and different answers, and the result is that each team is going to come up with some type of methods and some type of structures that respond to the change in circumstances, and they're going to do that without being told to do it. It's going to happen, whether you want it to happen or not. Now, in a traditional organization where you have middle management whose job it is to interpret a change in policy and tell the team what they're supposed to be doing as a result of that change in policy, it's going to happen there too. So it's something that's always going to happen in the context of these complex adaptive systems. So much so that there are what are called system archetypes. There are patterns of behavior that recur in many different types of situations for many different organizations. A couple of examples. This is an example called shifting the burden, where basically instead of addressing the root causality of a problem, you address some symptoms, and the end result is you make your problem somebody else's problem instead. Another example would be the tragedy of the commons. This would be an example where you've got a shared resource, like the perch in the Lac Léman. And you've got a lot of people who are fishing for perch, and they're in competition with each other, and they will eventually result in a situation where one is probably going to put out of business another, and unless you have some type of controlling loops in place, you're going to fish out all of the perch. So you're going to use up the resource. Another example, drifting goals. So this is the case where you set some kind of goals, you start doing work to achieve the goals, you don't achieve the goals, and what happens essentially is you change the goals in the course of doing the work. And of course, this is what happens in virtually any project I've ever seen. So those are some theoretical examples. Let's get down more close to IT. Let's think about the types of loops that exist that reinforce behavior when we release new systems, new versions of systems. If it's hard to do releasing, what some organizations will do is that they'll add more controls because they want to remove many of the incidents that are caused by releasing. And you add more controls, and it makes it even harder to release. And because it's harder, releasing becomes more fraught, more dramatic, more risky, and with the result that you release less and less frequently. Of course, that's not such a good thing because you release new versions of things because you want your new versions to be used by your customers to better achieve the outcomes that they're looking for. If, on the other hand, releasing is easy, then you will release more frequently. It becomes more routine. Because it becomes more routine, you're able to better handle many of the risks that occur during releasing, and as a result, you release even more frequently. So you've got these reinforcing loops that exist in releasing. Another example, let's suppose we have an organization that's got a responsibility for the full life cycle of some type of service, and you've got the people who design that service, who create that service. they like to tinker in the live environment, and they make the live environment unstable. So the structural response that we've seen in the past is that we separate the people into two separate teams. One team will create and design, another team will operate, and never the twain shall meet. But of course, that leads to a problem. The problem is often the operators don't have all the skills you might like them to have in order to resolve incidents and do other important things within the operating context. And so the structural response that you've seen in the past is that they say, well, okay, what we'll do is we'll change the role of the designers, and we'll give them more rights in order to be able to help out in the diagnosis of different types of situations. But of course, that leads to a situation where I've got two teams and I've got work handed off from one team to the other and back again, and that slows down the flow of work. That slows down resolution times. It disrupts the work. And so what we've seen more recently is people say, oh, well, what we need is to have a DevOps stream. Let's put everybody back together again. And so we seem to have come, to a certain degree, full cycle. And this has led many people today to say, I don't want to have to go through all of those cycles. That's ridiculous. Why can't we just find a good way of working, and we'll work that way, and that's it? And we won't go through all of this learning process for what works and what doesn't work. And so what a lot of organizations have done is they've seen presentations of structures like this one. Do you know this one? This is the presentation by Henrik Knieberg on the engineering culture at Spotify. Do you know that one? Have you seen that? No, that's more than 1 million downloads from YouTube. It's a wonderful presentation. It's extremely well done. And you look at it and you say, it's coherent. It makes a lot of sense. It's really cool. It seems to resolve a lot of the issues that you might say we have in our own organization. And people who do that filter out half of the presentation. They filter out the part where Knieberg says, this is just a snapshot of where we are today. We still have a lot of problems. There are still a lot of things that need to be improved, and the circumstances are always changing. Now they filter that out. They say, all right, it worked for them. Let's try it here. And so they implement squads and chapters and all of that good stuff in their organization. And then it's scientifically proven that 1.27 nanoseconds, after they implement that, the circumstances change. But now, they haven't lived through the work of figuring out how to structure themselves. They've simply taken over something from somebody else, and they're not equipped to understand how to make it evolve. And it comes to a very ugly situation where finally, what happens in too many cases is the management says, well, that didn't work. That was a disaster. That DevOps business, that's no good. As if the problem is with DevOps and not with their approach to figuring out how to change the structure of their organization. So we don't want to work that way. How are we going to work instead? Well, there are different models that I've been able to identify, but let's get down to a couple of concrete examples. So back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, let's say even in the 1990s, a typical evolution of structure occurred in many organizations. We started off small organization. It had a network of teams, and those teams would collaborate with each other on the basis of the implicit promises that they would make to each other about what they would be doing. And the leadership in those teams was determined on an ad hoc basis. There's a problem with that. The problem is essentially in terms of coordinating the inputs and the outputs of the different teams, and especially coordinating with the inputs coming from external suppliers. So what we saw in the past was typically an approach where you address that problem through centralization. And so you would centralize You would make more formal agreements between teams on how they would be working with each other. You would have a more formalized and centralized leadership for the organization. But that creates another problem, and that's the problem is the fact that you had these people who were working very effectively within their own teams, and now you've put the control and the management in a central place, and I've got a conflict between the agreements that were made and the effectiveness with which we used to work in our teams, a conflict between the central authority and the autonomy that we used to have. So that gets addressed typically by creating a hierarchy of authority, and the central authority will then delegate to middle managers the authority to manage the individual teams. So we have less centralization, and we want to organize collaboration on the basis of transversal processes that address what needs to be done in all of the teams. And of course, the leadership has been delegated, especially to middle managers. So we're still working with the concept that leadership is something that managers do, okay? Of course, the problem with that is that we have teams that are performing a certain function, and they often come into conflict with the processes that have been defined, because we make processes that are much too rigid, and they don't really take into account the different cultures of the different teams, and we resolve that kind of conflict by creating a matrix of management. We try to organize how teams collaborate with each other on the basis of a value chain that is defined for all the different activities within the organization. And of course, leadership is crossed according to the matrix. All right, that looks at an old problem, but it creates a new problem that in an age when circumstances are changing more and more quickly, we're creating an organization that's less and less agile. And so that kind of situation, which we're constantly addressing today, might be addressed in many different ways. One way, for example, could be the movement of IT personnel out of an IT department and into the department of their customers, and integrating them with their customers, looking at various continual improvement approaches as a way of doing collaboration, developing the concept of the servant leader, where anybody could be a leader and not necessarily something that managers do. So there are many different approaches to that sort of thing. But the point is that at each change in the organizational structure, you create the need for yet another change in the future. And this will continue. We don't know where this is going to be leading in the future. Another example, we have a startup. The startup has a small team, and that small team is good at what it does. The business prospers. It leads to more and more demands on the team. How do they react to that? Well, let's suppose they react to it by being able to deliver at a higher and higher rate, but at the cost of delivering more defects in what they deliver. Well, what do we do about that? Well, one of the structural responses that we've seen in the past is people say, well, if they were any good at controlling the quality of what they deliver, we wouldn't have this problem. And since they are delivering too many defects, we need to give to somebody else the responsibility for controlling the defects. And so they create a quality assurance team, and their role is to make sure that the right quality comes out of the pipeline and gets delivered to the customers. But of course, one of the many problems associated with creating teams like that is that they become a bottleneck, and it effectively slows down your ability to deliver, and frankly doesn't really improve the quality of that much either, but that's another issue. Let me take another example. The team decides it wants to be more agile. Don't we see a lot of that today? Anytime there's a catchword in the culture, and people say, oh yeah, that's where we are today. We want to be like that. We want to be modern, up to date. So they want to be more agile. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but maybe it's done for the wrong reasons. So they start acting in a so-called agile way, but they lack certain skills. They might lack some of the engineering skills that are needed for the deployment pipeline or for monitoring and so on and so forth. So how do we address that kind of situation? Well, this is an example drawn from team topologies, and there they say, well, what we can do is we can create a temporary DevOps team, and their role will be to basically consult and collaborate with those other teams that are lacking the skills that are needed to be successful in being agile. And so they do training, and they do coaching, and they do transfer of skills and tools. And then the theory says you disband the DevOps team. It was just a temporary thing in the beginning, right? All right, well, so much for the theory, but now put yourself in the shoes of especially the managerial personnel. And they said, well, we had a problem, we found a solution, solution is working very well, and now you want me to abandon that solution? You want to go from a situation that is known and working well to another situation that is risky and is unknown? Come on. And so it's a really hard thing to do, to convince people to stop doing something that apparently has succeeded. Now, it might be the right thing to do, but we're dealing with people, and you have to convince them of that. It has to make sense to them. Another example, you have a database management team, right? And according to the theory, we want to have the people who are designing the databases in the same team as the people who are creating the software that is using those databases. So we take the database team and we split it in two. Right? We split it in two, so we eliminate that DBA silo that existed. So we've hit all the right words, okay? We seem to be doing the right thing. We put the people who design databases into the same team with the people who design the software, and then we take the people who administer the databases and say, well, in any case, the databases, they're going to be in the cloud, so the people in the cloud can manage them. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, one of the big issues is that now we lose the end-to-end responsibility for the data that is being managed within those databases. So you have a situation where you've got a third party performing a task, and they're doing it typically, in the examples that I've seen, I'm in a number of examples here in Geneva of organizations that have done precisely this, where they say, okay, we've got a contract where we have explicitly defined what we need to deliver and how we need to deliver it and so on and so forth. And that's what we do. And we don't do more than that. You want more than that, you have to do a different contract. You have to pay us more, okay? And nobody has asked that there be a collaboration so that you have a cycle of continual improvement. Instead, what I see typically is you have a situation of finger pointing. And something goes wrong, there's an incident. Well, you didn't ask us to do that. It wasn't our fault. So people are talking about fault rather than improvement. So I think we need to be aware of these types of issues when we solve the problem of technology teams that have become silos. Okay, here's an example drawn from an organization that is a global organization. It has three main regions in the world, and each of those regions has any number of country-based IT organizations. So I've got 170 country-based IT organizations that are grouped in 3 main regions. So in one of those regions, they have the problem that many of the countries are not very rich, but they need to be able to provide IT services that correspond to the global centralized architecture of the services. And they don't have the resources to find the people and pay the people to do all of the different things that need to be done. So that's the problem. So what the organization then said is, let's take these cases and let's centralize those resources in one place. Let's centralize the people, let's centralize the infrastructure. And so instead of having a couple of people who do a poor to middling job in a lot of countries, let's have a somewhat larger group delivering good quality services to a lot of countries. Now that was the theory. Of course, the problem was that the people who were asked to do that had no real skills in adapting and defining their services for the needs of many different countries. Okay? They were used to providing services that were tuned to and adapted to the needs of one country. At the regional level, they didn't even have to do that. All they were concerned with at the regional level was the cost, make sure we kept the cost down. Okay, so that was the problem. And basically, they worked on it for about 3 years, about 4 years, and they learned how to be able to deliver solutions to multiple countries the hard way. Right? And ultimately, they were considered to be successful in what they were trying to do. So a lot of countries were getting much better quality services than they had ever had in the past. And that means that for the organization as a whole, their revenue was going up. They were being more profitable. So people were happy, except at the central regional organization, because they never really trusted these people. They never really believed that it could be done. And so now, 3 or 4 years later, after saying that's never going to work, they had egg on their faces. So the result of that was they said, okay, guys, thank you very much for that great work. We'll take over for now. You figured out how to do it? Okay, we'll do it on a broader global level. And that in and of itself might not be a bad thing. It's just that none of the people who actually figured out how to do it were invited to join the team that would operate that at a global level. Instead, you had all those people who were primarily concerned with keeping the cost down. So, naturally, it was found that their solution at the global level was much too costly. Okay? And so the reaction to that was nearshoring. Find a country where people were cheap to hire. But of course, these people too had no experience at all in providing multi-country services. And so the result of that was they basically shot themselves in the foot and they threw out the window all of the knowledge that they had developed and then had to try to redevelop it a second time. Let me give you one more example. We have a new system that is selected in an organization. The organization then says, all right, we don't know how to operate this system. We have to learn. We have to figure out what to do. There's new technology, there are new procedures, there are new practices we have to learn. And so they work on it, and they try to figure out how to do that. What team topologies tells you is that in such circumstances, you need to move into team collaboration mode. All right, team collaboration mode basically is saying that the good people who know how to do this, they're the ones who will transfer the knowledge to the people who don't know how to do it. And then what we find is that that kind of collaboration reduces the flow of work. And so they say, according to team topologies, you need to move to whatever your software or platform or whatever it is as a service mode as a result of that. Well, that, as far as I'm concerned, completely underestimates the difficulties of changing how two teams collaborate with each other. And it gives you a theory, and the theory sounds good, but when you get down to the practice of, I'm working on a team, and I have become accustomed to collaborating to people working on another team, and it's been hard to do, but we figured out something eventually, and now you're going to come back and say, all right, now we're going to change that. That's something that's extremely difficult to do. So let me skip over the last two examples, because we're running out of time here, and come to some type of closure here. So you're probably saying, okay, all these examples, they're examples of what's happening in a complex adaptive structure, a complex adaptive system. And you're saying, yeah, but after I leave DevOps Days, I need to go back to my work, and I need to say, what are we going to do? How are we going to address the problems that we have? And the message from treating IT organizations like complex adaptive systems is that there isn't one answer to that question. That you will try things, and what you try will influence other things in your organization, will influence yet other things in your organization, and will come back and kick you in the butt, and you never expected it. And you can't predict that in advance. And so there's no simple answer. It's not like a complicated system, it's a complex system. So what do I think you can do? Well, maybe these are not things that are guaranteed to deliver certain results, but certainly if it would be a good idea not to discourage them, okay? When you learn lessons, digest those lessons and keep them within the organization. Don't change the teams. Don't try to apply those lessons somewhere else. Try to foster end-to-end responsibility for any of the work that you're doing rather than fostering specialization in teams. And especially start from where you are rather than trying to imagine that there's a gap between where you are and where you theoretically think you ought to be. And make changes incrementally with where you are. And if they work, great, continue to make changes. And if they don't work, great. You've learned something, back out from it and try something else. And so by doing this, you can enhance this cycle of improving the capabilities in your organization. And amongst those capabilities, we have those that are fostered by organizational structure. But between you and me, there are other things that are a lot more important, like communicating with other people, collaborating in a team, developing concepts of leadership. Work on those first, and then you can come back to organizational structure later. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Robert.